Reverend Thomas Wells stood at the pulpit every Sunday morning, his voice filling the Grace Community Church with words of wisdom and comfort. At 45, he was tall with salt and pepper hair that made him look distinguished rather than old. His blue eyes carried a warmth that made each person feel as if his messages spoke directly to them. Truth is the foundation of all relationships, Thomas often preached. With God, with family, with community. The congregation nodded along, believing every word from the man who had led them for 15 years. In Palmetto Bay, a peaceful suburb of Miami, Thomas was more than just a preacher. He was a counselor to troubled marriages, a mentor to wayward teens, and a friend to the elderly and sick. People trusted him with their darkest secrets and heaviest burdens. After services, Thomas would stand at the church doors, shaking hands and exchanging brief conversations with his flock. "Beautiful sermon, Reverend," Mrs. Martinez said as she clasped his hand. "Your words about honesty in marriage really touched my heart." Thomas smiled and thanked her, though a small voice in his mind wondered if he truly deserved such praise. At home, Thomas lived with his wife Sarah and their 3 teenagers in a modest 4-bedroom house not far from the church. Sarah, with her kind eyes and patient manner, worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Their children, Michael, 17, Emma, 15, and Jacob, 13, were good kids, active in school and church activities. On Mondays, Thomas's day off, the family often went to South Beach for picnics. Today, Thomas watched his children playing volleyball near the water while he sat with Sarah on their beach blanket. "The children are growing up so fast," Sarah said, her hand finding his in the warm sand. Thomas nodded, studying their faces as they laughed in the sunshine. Michael had Sarah's smile and gentle manner. Emma was athletic and determined like Thomas's brother. And Jacob had a musical talent that reminded Thomas of his own father. "They're good kids," Thomas replied. "We've been blessed." That evening, as the family ate dinner together, Michael mentioned needing family medical history for a school project. "Dad, when did Grandpa die? Was it heart problems?" Michael asked between bites of pasta. Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest. His father had abandoned the family when Thomas was just 12, disappearing without explanation. The question opened old wounds. He had heart issues, yes, Thomas answered simply, not mentioning that his father might still be alive somewhere. Some truths were too painful to share, even for a man who preached honesty. Later that night, alone in his study, Thomas opened his Bible to prepare next week's sermon. The words blurred before him as doubts crept in, doubts about his faith that had been growing stronger recently. How could he guide others when his own belief wavered? How could he preach about family values when his own family history was so broken? Thomas closed the Bible and looked at the family photo on his desk. His smiling wife and children looked back at him, trusting and innocent. They believed in him completely. The weight of their trust pressed down on him. Outside his window, Miami's night sky was clear with stars that seemed to question him silently. Thomas sighed and turned back to his Bible, determined to find answers for his congregation, even as his own questions multiplied in the quiet of his heart. 2 weeks after the beach day, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a worried look on her face. Thomas entered the room and immediately noticed something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "The doctor called about my blood tests," Sarah said. "Nothing serious, but he wants me to come in for more tests. Something about unusual genetic markers they found." Thomas sat down beside her and took her hand. "I'll go with you." The next day, they sat in Dr. Patel's office, a small room with medical diplomas covering one wall and family photos on the desk. Dr. Patel, a kind man in his 50s with gentle eyes, explained that Sarah had a rare genetic condition that could cause mild anemia. "It's nothing to worry about," Dr. Patel assured them. "But since it's hereditary, your children might carry the same markers. Family testing would be wise." As they discussed the condition, Dr. Patel looked at some papers in Sarah's file. "That's interesting," he said, more to himself than to them. "What is?" Thomas asked. "This particular genetic variation is quite distinctive. It usually comes with certain physical traits, like the curved pinky finger that I notice all 3 of your children have." Dr. Patel demonstrated by bending his own little finger. "I noticed it when they came in for their sports physicals last month." Thomas frowned. "Is that unusual?" "Well, for it to appear in all 3 children, Both parents typically carry the gene, but looking at your hands. Dr. Paddle glanced at Thomas's straight fingers, then at Sarah's. Neither of you seem to have it. A small, uncomfortable silence filled the room. Sarah laughed nervously. Must have come from a grandparent, right? Quite possible, Dr. Paddle nodded. Genetics can skip generations or express themselves in different ways. On the drive home, Thomas was quiet. He couldn't stop thinking about the doctor's casual observation. He had never noticed the slight curve in his children's pinky fingers before, but now he couldn't unsee it. Are you worried about the anemia? Sarah asked, breaking the silence. No, no. Dr. Paddle said it's mild. Thomas replied, forcing a smile. Just thinking about Sunday's sermon. That night, after Sarah fell asleep, Thomas sat in the darkness of their bedroom with his laptop. He searched for information about genetic traits and inheritance patterns until his eyes burned from the screen's glow. According to what he read, the curved pinky trait was indeed strongly hereditary, typically coming from at least one parent. The next morning at breakfast, Thomas couldn't help studying his children's hands as they ate cereal. Michael, Emma, and Jacob all had the same slight curve to their little fingers. Neither he nor Sarah had this trait. His own father's hands had been large with straight fingers. He remembered that much. During the next few days, Thomas found himself noticing other things. None of his children had his narrow nose or Sarah's dimpled cheeks. Michael's laugh sounded nothing like his own. Emma's eyes, which he had always thought resembled Sarah's, now seemed completely different from both of theirs. On Thursday evening, Thomas was in his church office when Deacon Wilson dropped by with donation records. "Everything all right, Reverend?" Wilson asked. "You seem distracted lately." "Just tired," Thomas answered. "Been thinking a lot about family lately. How much do we really know about the people closest to us?" Wilson chuckled. "After 40 years of marriage, my wife still surprises me. That's the mystery of family." After Wilson left, Thomas stared at his computer screen. His sermon for Sunday was half finished, the cursor blinking accusingly at him. The topic was honesty as the foundation of faith. The irony wasn't lost on him. Thomas closed his laptop and instead pulled out his phone. He opened the browser and typed, "At-home DNA testing kits near me." His finger hovered over the search button for several seconds before he finally pressed it, feeling as if he was crossing a line he could never return from. 3 days later, a small package arrived at Thomas's church office. He quickly tucked it into his drawer when he heard a knock at the door. "Come in," he called, trying to sound normal. Emma poked her head in. "Dad, Mom said to remind you about dinner at the Rodriguez's tonight." "Thanks, sweetheart," Thomas said, forcing a smile. After Emma left, Thomas locked his office door and opened the package. Inside were 5 DNA test kits, each with simple instructions and color-coded tubes. The company promised fast results and complete privacy. Thomas stared at the kits, his hands shaking slightly. "This is wrong," he whispered to himself. "I should trust my family." But the curved pinky fingers and Dr. Paddle's casual remark kept returning to his mind. Thomas slipped the package into his briefcase and headed home. That evening at dinner with the church board member's family, Thomas watched his wife laugh and tell stories. Sarah looked beautiful in her blue dress, her eyes bright as she described a patient's recovery at the hospital. Could this woman, his partner of 20 years, be hiding something so enormous? "Thomas, you're quiet tonight," Mrs. Rodriguez noted as she passed him the bread basket. "Just thinking about Sunday's sermon," Thomas replied, his standard excuse lately. "What's the topic?" Mr. Rodriguez asked. "Truth and reconciliation," Thomas answered. The irony made his stomach twist. Later that week, Thomas found his chance when Sarah took the kids shopping for school supplies. Alone in the house, he moved quickly, swabbing the insides of his own cheeks first. Then he collected samples from Sarah's hairbrush and the children's toothbrushes. He felt like a thief in his own home, stealing DNA instead of valuables. "What am I doing?" he muttered as he sealed the samples in their tubes. But he couldn't stop now. That afternoon, Thomas mailed the package from a post office across town. The clerk told him results would come back in 10 to 14 days. For Thomas, it felt like waiting for a jury's verdict. During those 2 weeks, Thomas threw himself into his work. He visited more sick church members than usual, counseled 3 couples in crisis, and organized a youth retreat. Anything to keep busy, to stop the thoughts swirling in his head. His sermons changed, too. Without fully realizing it, Thomas began speaking more about forgiveness, about how humans make terrible mistakes. "We are all broken vessels," he told his congregation that Sunday. "Even those who seem most whole may have the deepest cracks." Mrs. Martinez caught him after service. "Powerful words today, Reverend. It's like you could see right into my soul." Thomas nodded, wondering what secrets this kindly grandmother might be keeping. Were all families built on hidden truths? The thought both troubled and comforted him. At home, Thomas noticed himself watching Sarah more closely. Did she look nervous when he mentioned his father? Was there a moment of hesitation when Michael asked about family traits for a biology project? Perhaps he was imagining things, seeing guilt where there was only innocence. Thomas prayed each night for the test results to prove him wrong, to show he was being paranoid and untrusting. 12 days after mailing the samples, Thomas's phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Your DNA test results are ready." Thomas stared at his phone, suddenly afraid to open the message. For a moment, he considered deleting it unread. They could continue as they always had, a happy family built on whatever foundation lay beneath. His finger hovered over the notification. Outside his office window, the Miami sun shone brightly on the church garden where they had baptized dozens of children, including his own. With a deep breath, Thomas tapped the email and began to read the truth that would change everything. Thomas sat alone in his church office, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. His laptop screen glowed with information that made his world spin. The DNA results were clear and devastating. Thomas was not the biological father of Michael, Emma, or Jacob. "This can't be right," he whispered, scrolling through the data again. The science was explained in simple terms even he could understand. The probability of paternity, 0%, for all 3 children. Thomas leaned back in his chair, feeling as if the air had been sucked from the room. 20 years of marriage. 3 children he had bathed as babies, taught to ride bikes, and prayed with every night. None of them were his, at least not by blood. The report contained another shocking detail. The biological father of all 3 children shared certain genetic markers with Thomas himself. The company noted this was unusual. It suggested the actual father was a close male relative of Thomas. A relative, Thomas said aloud to the empty room. His mind raced through possibilities. He had only one brother, David, who lived in California and had visited just twice in 20 years. His uncles were all older men who had never spent time alone with Sarah. Then a terrible thought struck him. His father, the man who had abandoned their family when Thomas was 12. The man Thomas had not seen in 33 years. Thomas opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo. His father, James Wells, stood smiling beside a young Thomas at a fishing dock. Though the photo was faded, Thomas could see his father's features clearly, the strong jaw, the deep-set eyes, the cleft chin that all 3 of his children had inherited. "No," Thomas whispered, "it can't be." With shaking hands, Thomas searched online for any trace of his father. After several searches, he found a 10-year-old news article about a James Wells who had worked as a visiting professor at Miami University in 2005, the year before Michael was born. Thomas checked his watch. It was 3:15 p.m. Sarah would be home from her hospital shift at 5 o'clock. The children were at various after-school activities. He had less than 2 hours to find more answers. He drove to his mother's assisted living facility across town. At 78, Eleanor Wells remained sharp-minded though her body was failing. Thomas found her in the community garden, her wheelchair parked beside a rose bush. "Thomas, what a lovely surprise," she said, her face lighting up. Then her smile faded. "What's wrong, son? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Mom," Thomas said, sitting on a bench beside her. "I need to ask you something important. When's the last time you saw Dad?" Eleanor's expression changed, hardening slightly. "You know I haven't seen James since he left us." "Are you sure?" Thomas pressed. "Maybe 15, 20 years ago." His mother looked away. "Why are you asking about him now?" "Please, Mom. It's important." Eleanor sighed. "He came here once, about 20 years ago. Said he was teaching in Miami for a semester. Wanted to make amends, whatever that means after abandoning your family." Thomas felt his heart racing. Did he ask about me? Did you tell him where I lived? Of course I did, Eleanor said. I thought you deserved the chance to confront him if you wanted to. He said he might reach out to you. She paused. He never did he? Thomas shook his head slowly. He asked about your wife too, Eleanor continued. I showed him your wedding photo. He seemed interested that you had married a nurse. Did he? Thomas swallowed hard. Did he mention knowing Sarah before? Eleanor frowned. No, why would he? She studied her son's face. Thomas, what's going on? Thomas couldn't bring himself to say the words. Instead, he patted his mother's hand gently. Nothing, Mom. Just trying to understand some family history. As Thomas drove home, pieces began falling into place. His father had been in Miami around the time each of his children was conceived. Sarah had often worked night shifts at the hospital during those years. There had been plenty of opportunity for something. Thomas parked in his driveway, seeing his home with new eyes. The family photos on the walls, the children's height marks in the kitchen doorway, the marriage certificate framed in the hallway, all of it now seemed like props in a play where he'd never known the real script. He checked his watch again. 4:45 p.m. Sarah would be home any minute. Thomas sat in the kitchen, the DNA test results printed and sitting on the table before him, waiting for the woman he had loved and trusted to explain how his father had fathered his children. Sarah's car pulled into the driveway at 5:10 p.m. Thomas heard the familiar sound of her keys jingling as she entered through the side door. He remained seated at the kitchen table, the papers spread before him, his hands folded as if in prayer. Thomas, you're home early, Sarah called, setting down her nursing bag. She walked into the kitchen and stopped when she saw his face. What's wrong? Thomas said nothing at first. He simply pushed the papers toward her. Sarah glanced down, confusion crossing her features before recognition dawned. The color drained from her face. What is this? She whispered, though her eyes told Thomas she already knew. DNA test results, Thomas replied, his voice steadier than he expected. I am not the biological father of our children. Sarah sank into the chair across from him. Thomas, I can explain. Can you? His voice rose slightly. Can you explain how my father, Sarah, is the biological father of Michael, Emma, and Jacob? Sarah's hands trembled as she covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. For several long moments, the kitchen was silent except for the tick of the wall clock and Sarah's shaky breathing. I never meant for this to happen, she finally said. Any of it. When? Thomas asked. When did you meet my father? Sarah wiped her eyes. 22 years ago. Before I met you. I was a new nurse at Miami General. James was admitted with chest pains. Nothing serious, but he was charming, attentive. I was young, only 23. He never mentioned he had a son. Thomas felt as if he were listening to a story about strangers. You had an affair with him. A brief relationship, Sarah corrected. 3 months. Then he said he was moving on to teach somewhere else. I never expected to see him again. Then you met me, Thomas said flatly. Sarah nodded. At the church volunteer day, I had no idea you were related to James. Your last name is common enough, and you never talked about your father. When did you realize? Thomas demanded. When did you know you had dated my father? Sarah looked down at her hands. 2 years after we were married, at your cousin's wedding. Your mother showed me old family photos, and there he was. James Wells. I nearly collapsed when I saw him. Thomas stood up and paced the kitchen. 2 years into our marriage, you discovered you had dated my father before me, and you said nothing? Sarah's tears fell freely now. I was terrified of losing you. James and I were over long before I met you. I loved you, Thomas. I still do. But the children, Thomas said, his voice breaking. Michael was born after you knew, then Emma and Jacob. How is James their father? Sarah's face crumpled in shame. He came back to Miami when we had been married about 5 years. He found me at the hospital, said he'd learned I had married his son. He wanted to reconnect. Thomas felt physically ill. And you just, what? Started sleeping with him while married to me. No, Sarah cried. It wasn't like that. At first, I just met him for coffee, to tell him to stay away from us. But he was persistent. Said he regretted abandoning you, but couldn't face you directly. I thought I could help heal your family somehow. By sleeping with him? Thomas's voice was razor sharp. It happened 3 times over 10 years, Sarah whispered. I was weak. Each time I hated myself afterward. Each time I swore it would never happen again. She looked up at Thomas. I know it's unforgivable. Thomas stared at the woman he had shared his life with for 2 decades. The mother of 3 children he had raised as his own. His partner in ministry and life. Did you ever love me at all? He asked, his voice hollow. Every day, Sarah said, reaching for his hand. Thomas, you have to believe me. I've loved you every single day of our marriage. Those moments with James were my greatest sin, my deepest shame. Thomas pulled his hand away. A car door slammed outside, Michael returning from baseball practice. In moments, their oldest son would walk through the door, expecting his normal family life to continue. The children can't know, Thomas said suddenly. Not yet. Sarah looked up, hope flickering in her tear-stained face. Does that mean? It means I need time, Thomas cut her off. I can't be here tonight. I can't look at you or them right now. As Michael's footsteps approached the side door, Thomas grabbed his car keys. Thomas, please, Sarah began. Tell them I had an emergency counseling session, he said, already moving toward the back door. I'll be in touch. As he walked out, Thomas heard Michael call out, Mom. Dad, I'm home. The normalcy of it cut through him like a knife. Thomas drove aimlessly through Miami's evening traffic, his mind spinning like the wheels of his car. Rain began to fall, matching his dark mood. After an hour, he found himself pulling into the parking lot of the Ocean View Motel, a small place near the beach where church visitors sometimes stayed. The woman at the front desk recognized him. Reverend Wells. Is someone from the church staying with us? No. Gloria, Thomas said quietly. I need a room for myself tonight. Gloria looked surprised but asked no questions as she handed him a key to room 112. The small room smelled of cleaning products and old air conditioning. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and finally let the tears come. 20 years of marriage, a family he thought was his, a life built on lies. His phone buzzed with messages from Sarah. Please come home. We need to talk about this. The children are asking where you are. Thomas turned off his phone and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling until he fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, Thomas called Deacon Wilson. I need to take some time away, Thomas explained. Family emergency. Can you handle the Sunday service? Of course, Wilson responded, concerned. Is everything all right? No, Thomas answered honestly. But I can't talk about it yet. Thomas didn't return home that day or the next. He extended his stay at the motel, venturing out only for food and long walks on the beach. On the 3rd day, he rented a small apartment near the church with a month-to-month lease. He filled it with basic furniture and clothes bought from a discount store. The place felt as empty as his heart. A week after leaving home, Thomas finally met Sarah at a coffee shop far from their neighborhood. The children think you're on a spiritual retreat, Sarah said, her eyes red from crying. But they're not stupid, Thomas. They know something is wrong. Everything is wrong, Thomas replied, stirring his untouched coffee. Will you come home? Sarah asked, hope in her voice. Thomas shook his head. I can't. Not now. Maybe not ever. Sarah began to cry quietly. What about the church? Your congregation needs you. Do they need a preacher who can't even recognize his own life as a lie? Thomas asked bitterly. I've taken a leave of absence. Wilson is handling things. And the children? Sarah pressed. Will you abandon them like your father abandoned you? The comparison stung deeply. They're not my children, Thomas said, the words burning his throat. They are in every way that matters, Sarah insisted. You've raised them. Loved them. They're yours, Thomas. Thomas stood up. I need more time. As weeks passed, rumors spread through the congregation. Some said Thomas was having a breakdown. Others whispered about marital problems. A few suggested a crisis of faith. None came close to the truth. Thomas avoided church completely, even attending a different congregation across town where no one knew him. He grew a beard and lost weight. When he occasionally saw church members in stores or restaurants, he turned away before they could approach. The children tried reaching out. Michael called several times, leaving voicemails that Thomas couldn't bring himself to answer. Emma sent text messages with family photos, each one a knife to Thomas's heart. Jacob sent a recording of himself playing piano, a new song he had learned. Thomas listened to Jacob's recording late one night in his sparse apartment. The boy had talent, something Thomas had always attributed to his own father's musical ability. Now he understood the real connection. 1 month into his self-imposed exile, Thomas received a letter from the church board. They expressed concern about his extended absence and requested a meeting to discuss his future with the congregation. Thomas placed the letter on his kitchen counter without responding. That evening, as rain pounded against his windows, Thomas looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. A stranger stared back, hollow-eyed, unshaven, lost. He had preached about forgiveness for years. He had counseled countless couples through betrayals far less complex than his own. "Practice what you preach," he told his reflection, but the words rang hollow in the empty apartment. 6 weeks after leaving home, Thomas hit his lowest point. That morning, he had received divorce papers from Sarah's lawyer, though he had been the one to leave. Seeing the legal document made everything painfully real. The Miami summer heat was oppressive as Thomas walked along the beach at sunset. Families played in the sand, reminding him of days with his own family, or what he had thought was his family. He watched fathers throwing balls to their sons, building sandcastles with their daughters. Had any of them discovered their children weren't biologically theirs? Did any of them carry the weight he carried? That night, a powerful storm hit Miami. Lightning flashed across the sky as Thomas drove through the rain. He had no destination in mind, yet somehow found himself parking outside Grace Community Church. The building was dark and empty. Using his key, Thomas let himself in, water dripping from his clothes onto the tiled floor. The sanctuary was silent except for the drum of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. Thomas walked slowly down the center aisle, passing the pews where his congregation had sat every Sunday, looking to him for guidance. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man they trusted to lead them couldn't even see the truth in his own home. Thomas reached the altar and fell to his knees. For weeks, he had been unable to pray, anger blocking his connection to God. But tonight, in the empty church with rain pelting the windows like tears, something broke inside him. "Why?" he cried out, his voice echoing in the darkness. "Why my father? Why my children? Why me?" No answer came except the crash of thunder. Thomas bent forward until his forehead touched the carpet. Sobs shook his body as years of ministry, marriage, and fatherhood collapsed around him. How long he remained there, he couldn't say. Perhaps minutes, perhaps hours. The storm continued to rage outside, matching the turmoil in his heart. "I thought I might find you here." A voice startled Thomas. He looked up to see Mrs. Eleanor Martinez, the 72-year-old widow who had been part of the church since before Thomas arrived. She stood in the center aisle, leaning on her cane, watching him with gentle eyes. "The church isn't open right now," Thomas said, embarrassed to be caught in such a state. Mrs. Martinez ignored his words and walked slowly to the front pew, where she sat down with a sigh. "When my Roberto died, I came here every night for a month, just to sit in the quiet and ask why." Thomas wiped his face and moved to sit beside her, keeping some distance between them. "Did you get an answer?" She smiled sadly. "Not the one I wanted. But eventually, an answer came." She studied his face. "You're carrying something heavy, Pastor." Thomas looked away. "I can't talk about it." "I don't need to know what it is," Mrs. Martinez said. "But perhaps you need to hear my story." Without waiting for his response, she continued. 50 years ago, I discovered my Roberto had another family in Cuba. A wife and 2 children he never told me about. I found letters he had hidden." Thomas turned to her in surprise. The Martinez family was one of the most respected in the congregation. "What did you do?" he asked. "First, I wanted to kill him," she said matter-of-factly. "Then I wanted to leave him. Finally, I confronted him. And he confessed everything. Begged forgiveness. Said his other wife had died years before, but he continued supporting the children. He kept it secret because he feared losing me." "Did you forgive him?" Thomas asked. Mrs. Martinez was quiet for a moment. "Not immediately. It took years. But yes, I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because unforgiveness was destroying me." She reached over and patted Thomas's hand. "Whatever has happened, Pastor, remember this. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting the wrong. It's about not letting the wrong destroy what's left. Thomas felt something shift inside him, not healing exactly, but perhaps the beginning of it. How did you and Roberto move forward? One day at a time, she answered. We built something new from the broken pieces, different from before, but strong in its own way. Mrs. Martinez stood slowly. The storm is passing, she said, nodding toward the windows where the rain had lightened. Storms always do. As she walked away, Thomas called after her, Mrs. Martinez, why did you come to the church tonight? She turned back with a small smile. I left my Bible here after prayer group, but perhaps God had other plans for my forgetfulness. Left alone again, Thomas looked up at the cross hanging above the altar. For the first time in weeks, he felt something besides anger and betrayal. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was a small light in the darkness, the possibility that even from complete devastation, something new might grow. 3 months after Thomas left home, the divorce papers remained unsigned on his apartment table. After his night in the church with Mrs. Martinez, something had shifted. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a crack in the wall of his anger that let in a sliver of light. On a warm Sunday morning, Thomas sat in the back row of Grace Community Church, wearing casual clothes and a cap pulled low. He had come to hear Deacon Wilson preach, to see the congregation that had once been his responsibility. Many people glanced his way, but few recognized their former pastor with his beard and thinner frame. After the service, Thomas lingered in the parking lot, leaning against his car. He watched families emerge from the church doors, chatting and planning Sunday lunches. His family was not among them. Sarah had started taking the children to a church across town to avoid gossip. Not hard enough, apparently. Thomas replied with a small smile. Wilson studied him. You look terrible. Thanks for the encouragement. Wilson nodded. They've been asking questions, especially Michael. I'm not their biological father, Thomas said, the words still painful to speak aloud. My own father is. To Wilson's credit, his expression showed only momentary shock before returning to calm concern. That's a heavy burden, my friend. Sarah and I can't go back to what we were, Thomas continued. Too much damage, but the children shouldn't suffer for our mistakes. What will you tell them? Wilson asked. The truth, a version they can understand. Thomas looked out the window. I've been so angry about what was taken from me that I forgot what I still have. The next day, Thomas met Sarah at a family counselor's office. It was the first time they had seen each other in over a month. She looked thin and tired, but there was determination in her eyes. Thank you for coming, Thomas said formally as they sat in the waiting room. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked. Telling them? Thomas nodded. They need to know why their family has fallen apart. Not every detail, but enough. The counselor, Dr. Rees, helped them plan how to tell the children in an age-appropriate way. For Jacob, the youngest at 13, they would explain simply that Thomas was not his biological father, but would always be his dad. For Emma and Michael, they could share more details, excluding the most painful parts about James being Thomas's father. A week later, the family gathered in Dr. Rees' office. The children entered cautiously, eyeing Thomas with a mixture of hurt and hope. Dad? Emma said tentatively. Are you coming home? Thomas felt his heart break all over again. Not yet, sweetheart. There's something important Mom and I need to talk to you all about. What followed was the hardest conversation of Thomas's life. Dr. Rees guided them gently, helping with words when Thomas or Sarah faltered. The children's reactions varied from shock to tears to anger, with questions Thomas wasn't always prepared to answer. So you're not really our dad? Jacob asked, his voice small. Thomas moved to kneel before his youngest son. Biology doesn't make a father, Jacob. I've been your dad from the day you were born, and I always will be. As painful as the conversation was, something unexpected happened. For the first time in months, Thomas felt the weight on his chest lighten slightly. The truth, even a difficult truth, brought a kind of freedom. In the weeks that followed, the family began therapy, Thomas and Sarah separately, and the children both individually and as a group. Thomas moved to a larger apartment with a spare bedroom so the children could stay with him on weekends. One Sunday morning, 2 months after telling the children, Thomas stood before his congregation again. His leave of absence had officially ended. He looked different now, thinner, with touches of new gray in his hair, his eyes carrying a depth they hadn't before. "Today," he began, looking out at the familiar faces, "I want to talk about rebuilding after devastation." His sermon wasn't perfect. His voice cracked at times. But as Thomas shared his journey, not the private details, the struggle with broken trust and the slow path toward healing, he saw heads nodding. Many in the pews had faced their own versions of betrayal and loss. Sometimes, Thomas concluded, we must let go of the life we plan to embrace the life that awaits us. It may not be what we expected. It may not be what we wanted. But with faith and courage, it can still be beautiful. After the service, as Thomas stood at the church doors, Mrs. Martinez took his hands in hers. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Pastor," she said with a knowing smile. "The storm has passed." Thomas nodded, knowing she was right. The rain had stopped, though the ground remained wet. New growth was possible now, different from before, but perhaps stronger for having weathered the storm.